Welcome to the very first episode of Snapshots of WWII. Sisters explore their grandfather's legacy. I'm Amanda.
And I'm Jenne, and today we're going to begin tracing the journey of the 357th Infantry Regiment's Medical Detachment, the same unit that our grandfather was served in during World War II. The 357th served directly within the ranks of the 90th Infantry Division.
The 90th Infantry Division, known as the Tough Hombres, was a legendary U.S. Army unit that fought across France and Germany in some of World War II's toughest battles. We're starting with the very first official minute report, dated March 22, 1944, at Camp Kilmer, New Jersey, a place that marked the final stop for thousands of American soldiers before crossing the Atlantic. Minute reports are brief official records that document daily movements, actions, and sometimes conditions of each military unit.
In this episode, we're going to explore the preparations for overseas deployment, the atmosphere of Camp Kilmer, and the troop ship that would carry the 357th into war, the HMS Dominion Monarch.
By March 1944, the United States was preparing for Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied France. The 90th Infantry Division, which had trained extensively stateside, was being readied for combat.
Our grandfather's unit was part of that buildup. On March 22nd, 1944, they arrived at Camp Kilmer, a bustling staging area just outside of New York City. At its peak, Camp Kilmer processed over 20,000 troops per day. It was the last American soil that many men would ever stand on.
We're lucky to have detailed minute reports from their medical detachment, giving us a clear record of the movements and helping us walk the same path our grandfather once did. Jenne, what are the minute reports for March 22nd, 1944?
March 22nd, 1944. Unit moved by train from Fort Dix, New Jersey to Camp Kilmer, New Jersey. Unit processed through POE Preparation Center. Embarked for overseas duty via HMS Monarch. March 23rd, 1944. Unit departed for England.
It sounds simple, but that one sentence marked the beginning of a massive leap into the unknown. Our grandpa, Malcolm Mersch, was 25 years old, newly married just 2 months before.
I can't even imagine the feelings that he had that day. I mean, the juggling and shaking of the train and travel to embarking into a new camp. Once they were off the train, they were hit with the chill of a New Jersey spring, and they're leaving the predictable routine of stateside training for the imminent threat of war overseas.
Processing through the POE, or Port of Embarkation, meant health checks, equipment inspections, vaccinations, censorship briefings, and a lot of waiting. I'm sure Grandpa's mind wandered home to his family in St. Louis, Missouri a few times.
In the war memoir called Battle Surgeon by William M. McConaughey, MD, he described the embarkation process in detail. He stated, the division was to be carried on 21 trains, leaving every 10 minutes. Starting about noon, I was named car commander for one of the railroad cars carrying the medical detachment. In order to assure quick loading of the train, we carefully practiced the standard loading procedure until all the men understood it. Then we wrote numbers in chalk on each man's helmet, corresponding with seat numbers in the cars, so that we could track everyone easier, and it also tell at a glance if things were in order. When our turn came, we piled our duffel bags on trucks, marched to the camp rail yards, got our baggage off the trucks there, and we climbed into the train.
Before boarding the HMS Dominion Monarch, Grandpa first went through Camp Kilmer, a massive Army staging area in New Jersey, where thousands of soldiers were processed, trained, and prepared for deployment. It was the gateway to the war for so many men like him.
To help us understand what Camp Kilmer was like and why it was so important, we spoke to Kimberly Tryba, a landscape designer who studied the site extensively. Here's what she had to say.
Today, we're joined by Kimberly Tryba, a landscape designer and educator and co-founder of Leela Studios, a New York City-based landscaping practice. Her award-winning research at Rutgers uncovered the layered history of Camp Kilmer, one of the largest World War II staging areas in the U.S., and brought forgotten stories like those of our grandfather's unit back to light.
Since then, Kimberly has built a dynamic practice, creating projects that weave together history, ecology, and community. We're thrilled to have her here and explore the hidden stories of Camp Kilmer and why they still matter today. Kimberly, your work connecting history and place is incredibly meaningful to us, and welcome to our podcast. Nice to meet you.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it. Glad to be here.
We're glad you're here.
So glad you're here. For listeners who may not be familiar, can you start by explaining what Camp Kilmer was and the role it played during World War II?
Briefly, most people who are familiar with World War II may remember that the United States was very late in getting into the fray, right? That Europe and even on the Pacific fronts were already years in progress. So when the United States decided that it was going to get involved, and of course that was right after Pearl Harbor, there were some very large decisions that had to be made that resulted in Camp Kilmer and 4 other forts located across the United States. They basically were charged with taking an army of 100,000 people and needed 2 million people into the war. So the logistics, as you can imagine, trying to get people trained, is that they decided that they would leave local camps and training fields across the United States where they were, but that they would need to have locations on the East and West Coast that would sort of act as stationing places where troops would be funneled in from other areas in the United States, organized, and then shipped either to the European front or to the Pacific front. What Camp Kilmer represented was the largest staging camp during World War II. The incredible thing about this, and again, emphasizing speed, and this is where sometimes the military is really good and resourceful, is that they were able to pull from green light saying, yes, we're going to build this. They went from site selection to the first troops arriving within 9 months. So it's a really incredible story. There are a lot of historical aspects to it. Obviously, this was a deviation in how conflict was managed, but it was also a dramatic period where modernism was being practiced, and they called upon an architect, Antonin Raymond, who had done a number of projects for the government at that point. He'd been a student of Frank Lloyd Wright's and had worked with him in Japan on the Tokyo Hotel, which was one of the only buildings left standing after a massive earthquake, because it was about reinforced concrete. So when you marry this idea of a new modernist approach of using materials in a different way, materials certainly that were easily transportable, and that then you kind of tie that in with military efficiency. There was this also modernist idea of prefabrication. So they were able to mobilize quite quickly to build this camp. There is one other historic aspect to it, which is important to my practice, the practice of landscape architecture, which was it also engaged a young man named James C. Rose, who was one of the modernist 3 from Harvard, the Harvard 3, who were credited with bringing modernism to the practice of landscape architecture. Kind of a quirky fellow, and it is rumored that Camp Kilmer is the only commercial project that he worked on. In fact, it was the only time he actually worked for another firm, which was Antonin Raymond. Another funny story that I got from my professor, Dean Cardassis, who is the executive director of the James C. Rose Center in New Jersey, was that Antonin came to James and said, okay, we need a design for this camp. And James promptly took the weekend. Everybody came back from the weekend, found the drawings on the desk saying, here you go, I'll be back after I get some rest. And James didn't show up for 5 days. But the funny thing is, as the story goes, that the architects and engineers of Antonin's firm couldn't improve upon the design. So this is what the camp ultimately ended up being, was James C. Rose's design. So there's a lot of really wonderful notes of importance beyond the fact that this was a major military establishment in support of World War II.
I would have to agree. That's remarkable.
Yes.
Anything else I can tell you about that, let me know.
When did you first realize that this campus, one of 4 Rutgers campuses, had once been the largest World War II staging area in the country? How did that come about?
That came about with actually was the initial discovery of the location. I never even knew that it was on our campus. I was a graduate student at Rutgers at the time, and getting ready to figure out what my thesis was going to be. And my thesis advisor, Kate John Alder, said, hey, did you happen to know that this area on Livingston campus, I was on Cook campus, I wasn't even on Livingston campus, which was across the river, you may want to go check this out. And Dean Cardassis had also mentioned something about it. So once I got over to this area on the campus, and I'm looking at kind of nondescript buildings, and I was like, really, what's this about? And I said, well, have it on good authority that, at least maybe there's something here about James C. Rose, maybe there's something here about Anthony Raymond that's worth exploring. And just by starting to dig into the story, asking a lot of questions of people who were on the planning department and the landscape team at Rutgers led to a very wide net, casting a wide net, not only with historical societies, with veterans associations, a lot of time at the National Archives. And it was shocking to me that despite the fact that this camp had existed, that there really wasn't one central repository of this information. So it took the better part of a little more than a year. I actually had to extend my last year there in order to pull all of the information together to write this thesis of mine. Yeah.
When it comes to research, I completely understand, and so does Amanda, how it could take a lot longer than you think. And it takes a lot more locations than you would imagine. And it was so important to you that you extended your school for it. That's amazing.
Yeah, I extended by another semester. Yeah.
My gosh. Well, I appreciate it. I'll say that now. Wow.
Definitely.
That's great.
The cool thing about it is again, when you're looking at it, it's not immediately apparent. But if you really look closely at that area of the campus, and the buildings that I went to originally were part of the original warehousing area, which is where the trains would come in. I mean, this was a huge undertaking. The troops had to be basically shipped to this area, then put on trains to the waterfront in Perth Amboy and elsewhere, then shipped, put on boats to get to the Eastern Front. I mean, there weren't big airlifts at that time, right? So even laying the tracks, this is before the New Jersey Turnpike, ladies. This is, even the site selection of how they were going to be able to get equipment in and out and how they were going to lay tracks and get people in and out, in a fairly quick and efficient way was a huge undertaking. So the buildings I originally saw were these intake, almost warehouse buildings, which have since been converted into, there are some offices, there are some storage areas there, particularly for some land cores, some earth cores. I think it was once a couple of the women's sporting teams used it for storage, but it's also adjacent to, a part of the forest, which is one of the last remaining strips of native forest in the state of New Jersey. So there's a lot going on there, and but once I actually started looking around, I realized that the streets were kind of oddly named. They had number whatever or letter I, and you're like, that's kind of weird. Why would Rutgers name the streets that way? Well, it turns out those were the original street names and numbers of the camp. So once you start realizing that there's more that's still in existence there beyond just these buildings, then of course it opens up a little bit of a Pandora's box. And once I found that Rutgers actually has the original drawings of the camp, which is insane. I mean, these things, just the fact that they actually have them, you realize the full extent of the camp. So Livingston campus itself was acquired by Rutgers, which is a land-grant university. Land-grant universities were established by Lincoln, which basically allowed these institutions access to land if they also were going to be offering curriculum not only in agriculture, but also military training and a few other things that were mandatory. So when the camp it had long been inactive, the university was able to purchase some of the land. When you look at Livingston campus and you overlay it with the original camp plan, you will easily see that Livingston campus is only comprises a third of the original camp. This camp was immense, and then actually was added on to later on in the neighboring towns. There's still existing buildings from the additional acreage that was acquired as the camp needed to be expanded for African American troops and women who had to be kept separate. So it became a lightning rod for a lot of controversy. I mean, how do you engage African Americans at a time when they really weren't allowed to do much? They couldn't even ride the front of the bus at this time, right? If you put it into context, there's a lot to unpack there. And the more you dig, the more you find. One of the other things that that I learned first at looking at the camp was noticing that the rooftops were had very unique patterning to it. It wasn't just all the same tiles as you would expect, in regular army barracks. Well, it turned out that they employed a technique called dazzle camouflage, which had been used in World War I for battleships that were used to basically make it hard for submarines to target ships. So they were able to use this because Camp Kilmer was actually embedded. They used it in agricultural land, but it was surrounded by residential communities. So this camp was actually part of an extended community network. And they wanted to make sure that if bombers ever made it to our skies, that it would be harder for them to target where
This
the
can.
camp actually was. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's smart. I mean, and
There's
dangerous.
no proof that it actually, there's no proof it actually had to be tested, but, it was just amazing when you really realize the context where people were going about their normal lives just on the other side of a fence of what was going on here.
Railroad tracks still there?
Some of them are, yes, particularly around the area. If you are looking at the layout of Livingston campus on the south end of it, closest to the river, where these warehouses are, a number of the tracks still exist, and you can follow them on out for a good distance, which I've done before.
Really? I bet. That's crazy. I wonder if those were the ones that took them straight to the loading area.
It would, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Oh, that's wild. That's so cool.
Yeah.
I have to get there.
Yeah.
Is there a way that we would be able to see some of that if we contacted someone there?
Yeah, yes. I mean, I would recommend, you could contact the planning department, but frankly, that area of the campus is open to the public. There's
Okay.
no fence there. So if you were interested in going there, it's certainly accessible.
Great.
That's great to know. Thank you.
Yes. You've described Camp Kilmer as palimpsest. How does that idea help understand how World War II history still lives beneath the modern campus?
Well, palimpsest basically is what that original word means is that back in the day, before books were mass printed, right, they were written on skin usually, and it was very expensive to come up with that kind of material for books. So very often, whoever wanted to write a new book, they might reuse a lot of these documents, but they'd have to scrape the ink off. But you can never get all of it off, right? So there's still on some of these recycled documents and books, if you look carefully, you can still see the original text or drawings. So applied to the landscape, where there are still these vestiges, if you will, this proof of what was there first and how it continues to survive. And it's something that, particularly for those of us who tend to work in the urban realm, you're always working on land that's been used for something else, right? So there's this tension between, what do you keep, what do you remove, what can you reuse, repurpose, or how do you celebrate what was there in a way that that can still harken back to what was there historically. A great example here in New York City, for example, would be the High Line. The High Line was an elevated railroad. And most of it had been removed by, the 70s, if you will. It was a long fought fight to have that preserved in some way. And so the High Line, as you know it today, if you look, they've actually retained some of the elements of that original rail line. It's not the original rail line because the whole structure had to be rebuilt, but there are references to rails. There are references to other things that harken back to that time when it was used for something else. So in that way, a palimpsest can still be applicable.
Wow.
Yeah.
I can't even imagine. So yeah, you've had to really research and go through so many different types of fragmented records. I could imagine 2, 3, 4 things might have been placed on that before you saw it.
The one area had remained relatively unchanged, but certainly, on the other areas of the campus, a lot of the campus buildings have since been removed. But when the university first purchased them, a lot of the original Army barracks were used either for classrooms or mostly classrooms. And in fact, in my research, even just speaking with other members of our practice, particularly New Jersey ASLA, right? Because it was then ASLA is the American Society of Landscape Architects. As I was talking to a lot of my colleagues, it was amazing how many people had a direct connection. One person actually had been born there in the hospital, and shared with me her birth certificate, which is I actually have a copy of in my thesis. It's amazing every time I speak about it, particularly in New Jersey, somebody will tell me a story of someone they know who is somehow affiliated. One of my professors, who is German, actually had a relative who had to go through Kilmer because he was a prisoner of war, who ended up on his way to someplace else in Arizona. But it's amazing how many people have connections there. It was also the location of one of the largest airlifts in history by Eisenhower when there was the Hungarian revolt and they had to airlift 51,000 people in a very short period of time. That's where they went, and that's why there's still a very large Hungarian population in New Brunswick. Those are the people, they're all descendants of, if not some of the people who were children that came through. So palimpsest is relative. It's not necessarily a physical thing. You can also look at the population. You can look at some of the practices. You can look at some of the people who are still there, and it's a living legacy.
That's so fascinating.
And it just encompasses why preserving this type of place matters for so many people, especially the history. I love history, but look at his families. This is their story. Okay. How does uncovering and interpreting Camp Kilmer's layered history influence your work, or how has it as a landscape designer and educator today?
Well, for me, it's not, I'm not an expert in historical restoration, for example. Where I grew up in New England, we had a lot of turn of the century, and by turn of the century, I mean turn of the not just the 20th century, but also the 19th century factories that exist. And even the home that I grew up in is a former mill worker's house. And in growing up and seeing a lot of either these former mills being falling into disrepair or eventually repurposed for something else, it begs the question, is there a value to keeping this? And I think that even though we don't do, and I don't do historic restoration specifically, I do work predominantly in the urban realm. So there is this question: what do you keep? What do you find a way to repurpose what it maybe doesn't have any value, as we look at it that way. Land having the value that it does in the urban realm, there's an argument for adaptive reuse that moves beyond nostalgia, right? It really, we have to think about this as maybe strategic value creation, not sentimental preservation. Yes, this represents something in the grand scheme of things, but is it enough to commemorate with a plaque? Or is there value in preserving the structures and the landforms, and the journey through that on a more profound level? And there are ways that we can balance that in our approach as designers. Like, we can reframe the cost of things, right? Like, people say, these buildings are going to take too much to retrofit. Well, is it? At the end of the day, if we look at it as a life cycle value, not an upfront expense, right? Demolition and replacement may look cheaper on paper, but only because the longer term costs are then externalized. But retaining and adapting, say, these warehouse buildings, I mean, we can bring it into more contemporary terms. We can avoid embodied carbon loss and disposal costs, for example, right? Carbon neutral is a big conversation. We can leverage the existing infrastructure, the foundations and the utilities. They've never changed the roads, for example. If they didn't work, right, there would be an argument for not keeping them. That when you also looking at roads, there's other infrastructure that you don't immediately see, particularly the general public, the sewer lines, all of that, the electrical. Some of it needs to be changed, some of it not. You can reduce your entitlement and your construction timelines, right? Instead of building new, because demolition and removal. And then it also offers like a phased investment rather than a single capital hit, right? And I could go on about that, but there's also like matching the needs of what the in this case the university could say that it has to what these structures also offer, and they're already being used, for example. So yeah, it's about identity too. It's offering something that nobody else has. How many other college campuses can say that they were a former Army base? I'm going to tell you, Fort Ord on the West Coast is the only other one right now, so that I'm aware of. I'm sure there are others, but Fort Ord and Fort Kilmer were the two. One for the Western Front, one for the European Front.
So history does influence so many types of work, but yours in particular is very interesting. It's really great thread. It's almost like you could just keep pulling.
Looking back on your work, what do you hope listeners take away about Camp Kilmer, its history, and the role your research plays in keeping it alive?
I would say one of the things that remains one of my goals is to pick up the flag again, the torch, if you will. I so appreciated having the opportunity to pull this cultural history together, but there's more work to be done, right? And if there's a way to expand the message, which is why I'm so grateful for having the opportunity to speak with you today, it's something that I still hope to get back to and find a way to elevate this history in a way that not only is something that speaks to people who have a direct connection to Camp Kilmer, but to others who have yet to be inspired by it. And I think we all need to be those agents of change and preservation and how those work together in our shared history.
I very much agree with you. I love that.
Yeah, Kim, thank you so much for sharing your incredible knowledge and passion with us today. And it's amazing to hear how you bring history, design, and personal stories together. And we really appreciate your time.
Thank
We
you.
know our
And if
listeners will too.
anybody's interested in my thesis, it is online through academia. I think it's .edu. If you want to read the whole thing, it's if nothing else, a bibliography might be worth anyone who's looking for information or starting their own thread.
I'll be reading it.
Yeah, it's definitely on my list.
How can we and our listeners find you?
I'm most easily reachable through LinkedIn. I have a profile there. It's just my name. I'm not hiding. I'm one of the few Trybas on there. So I invite people to probably grab me there. This is the most consistent.
Okay, you're so cool. And I'm so thankful that you were the first podcast guest of ours. I'm so happy you said yes to us. I've learned so much. I'm fangirling. You're so cool. I mean, you're so interesting, your life's work.
Yeah, the more we were looking into it, we're like, wow.
This lady is great.
Yes. Like,
like, thank you. I'm really flattered and really tickled to have had the chance to talk about this again. I really still feel very passionately about it, and hope, as I said, that I'll be able to return to doing more work on it.
Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.
And you have a great night.
You too.
Thank you. Bye. Hearing that really gives me a sense of scale and purpose of Camp Kilmer. How organize and prepare thousands of men like our grandfather before they even set foot on the ship.
And then came the moment, boarding the HMS Dominion Monarch, a British luxury liner converted into a troop transport. It could carry over 3,000 troops. Built in the 1930s, the Dominion Monarch was repurposed during the war to ferry soldiers across the Atlantic.
It was fast and large, and because it was a British ship, American troops were now under the responsibility of the Royal Navy for their journey. While not a combat zone yet, the Atlantic crossing was dangerous. German U-boats were prowling the waters. Convoys had to zigzag to avoid torpedoes.
And for the men aboard, like our grandfather, this was no cruise. Cramped quarters, seasickness, blackout conditions, and constant tension were the norm. During the day and night, life preservers were always on or within reach.
Reading the first minute report made me realize how fast everything was moving. Grandpa arrived at Camp Kilmer to crossing the Atlantic in days.
Grandpa probably didn't know exactly where he was going. None of them did. And maybe that was the point. Keep them focused, keep them moving.
It was the quiet before the storm. The next time they touched land, it would be in England, and soon after, Normandy.
The entire 90th Infantry Division was on the move during this period, deploying in waves across multiple East Coast camps. The 357th, 358th, and 359th regiments all passed through these staging areas, Camp Kilmer included, where soldiers were processed, trained, and prepared for the journey ahead. Every step was carefully coordinated, from paperwork and medical checks to final briefings, before they finally set sail across the Atlantic.
The 90th would eventually arrive in England to begin final preparations for D-Day, but the journey began much earlier. It all started here at Camp Kilmer, where soldiers like our grandfather were processed, trained, and sent onto the decks of a British troop ship, leaving home behind and heading into the uncertainty of war.
Today's report might seem calm compared to the battles that lie ahead, but it's a powerful reminder that war begins long before the first shot is fired. It starts with movement, preparation, and countless small sacrifices. The sleepless nights, the drills, the endless logistics, all laying the groundwork for what's to come.
Even before our grandfather ever faced enemy fire, he was already in the midst of service. Picture him training along thousands of medics, marching through drills, packing and unpacking gear, learning every procedure by heart, all in preparation for moments no one could predict. Quietly, tirelessly, they trained not for glory, but to save the lives in chaos that would soon erupt in distant battlefields.
Next week, we follow the 357th as they arrive in England and begin the grueling training for the D-Day invasion.
We'll read from the April 1944 reports, take a look at the camps in southern England, and explore how medics trained for the upcoming chaos.
Thanks for joining us on the first episode of Snapshots of World War II. If you're enjoying the journey, be sure to subscribe and share with someone who loves history.
This podcast is a tribute to our grandfather and to every medic who carried more than their own weight. Until next time.
Stay curious and keep remembering.